You're inspired because you've seen what can be done with a half-decent camera and some manual settings. But maybe you've never turned to the big M on the dial. Or maybe it's been a while. Maybe you know what to do, but you're here looking for something new. This episode might be for you. That rhymed and sounded really silly. Hello everybody, my name is Marco and welcome to another episode of this thing I call Chosen Idea. Today we're talking about camera basics. And whether it's a camera from yesterday or today, the principles on which they work are pretty much the same, and the concepts really aren't that difficult once you get your head around them. Now, I'm going to be using the word exposure rather than image or photograph, because what we're essentially doing is we're exposing the sensor in a digital camera, or we're exposing the film in a traditional film camera. Technology in today's modern cameras set to automatic can assess and give you technically correct exposures in a pretty impressive way. What I mean by technically correct is the highlights aren't blown out, so you still have some details in them, and the shadows aren't inked in, so you still see some details in them as well. Well, that's not what we're going to spend time talking about today. The reason we're switching to manual mode is to give us some creative control as artists. Not necessarily technically correct images, which we can get by keeping our camera on automatic. Now, the three components to getting a correct exposure are called the exposure triangle, kind of like the Bermuda Triangle. Actually, nothing like the Bermuda Triangle. Now, if this little learning device called the exposure triangle works for you, you're pretty much 90% there. What are the corners of the exposure triangle? The first one is shutter speed, the next one is aperture, and the last is ISO. Now, shutter speed. It stands to reason you're going to need a device or a mechanism that exposes either the film in a traditional film camera or the sensor in a digital camera for a given amount of time. For instance, when your camera tells you your shutter speed is 150, that's 1/50th of a second. Now, a camera can have either a digital shutter or a mechanical shutter, or it can have both. Now, using one of your eyes as an analogy for the workings of a camera isn't that bad an idea. Now, we've already talked about the shutter. Now, imagine the shutter is your eyelid, the only difference being that your eyelid can squint, while a shutter is either completely open or completely closed. The second part of it is an aperture. Now, the aperture in your eye is sort of your iris, because your iris controls how large the opening is in the center. Now, what controls the opening in the center of the aperture mechanism is a series of blades in a circular arrangement that expand inward and outward, changing the size of that hole in the center. By a long shot, the most confusing thing for people jumping into this stuff for the very first time is understanding the system of measure used to describe the amount of light coming in through an aperture, and that's f-stops. The reason f-stops are so confusing to people is the fact that a larger f number describes a smaller aperture opening. A small f number describes a larger aperture opening. So an f1.2 or f1.4 means that you're probably shooting with a high shutter speed or in very low light, because the aperture opening is large. An f16 or f22 describes a small aperture opening. So maybe you're doing a long exposure, or maybe you've got a ton of light and you're trying to cut that back. Anyway, if you can get your head around that, you're golden. Some of the most sought after lenses out there are the most sought after lenses in part because they can go to apertures like f2.0, 1.8, 1.4, 1.2. There are more exotic and less practical lenses that may go to 1.1 or 0.9 something. In the real world, they're really not all that useful for reasons I'm not going to go into with this video. Why would people want a lens that can open up so much? Well, they may want to shoot at high shutter speeds, they may be shooting in low light, they may want very shallow depth of field, which is something I'll go into a little bit later, or they may want to lower their ISO. ISO is the third corner of our exposure triangle. ISO just stands for International Standards Organization. Now, these are the fine folks that back in the film days gave us the numbers that we had on our film to tell us how sensitive the film was to light, or how fast it was. The higher the ISO, the lower the light conditions that we could shoot in, and the higher we could put our shutter speeds. Now, today, we still use ISO when we set the gain on the sensor of our digital cameras. The higher the gain or the higher the ISO on our sensor, again, the higher the shutter speeds that we could use and the lower light conditions that we can shoot in. Now, that all sounds great, right? Well, using a high ISO has its downside. Back in the days of film, the downside was that the higher the ISO, the larger the crystals in the emulsion of the film that we were using. Now, the grain that you would see in some old photographs was actually those crystals becoming visible because they were so large. In general, film grain was something we wanted to reduce as much as possible, although it has been used to some artistic effect. In the digital world, increasing the gain of a camera sensor, or increasing its ISO, means introducing noise, so there are parallels to be drawn between the analog and digital worlds. The upside to shooting digital is, though, a 400 ISO digital image compared to a 400 ISO analog image has far less noise in it than an analog image has film grain. Not only that, but in the digital world, ISOs can go so high some cameras practically see in the dark. M isn't just for manual mode, it's also for muscle, and that's what we're going to flex, our creative muscle, because we're done talking about the 3 points of our exposure triangle: shutter, aperture, ISO, and now we're going to talk about depth of field, DOF. Landscape photographers often don't concern themselves with fast lenses because they're often shooting in daylight with apertures like f/22, which give them very sharp images right from foreground to background. Portrait photographers, however, love fast lenses, so they can open up those apertures to get super shallow depth of field to knock out any background details that they don't want behind their subjects. One of the best ways to learn how to apply some of these techniques is to look at some photographs that you want to emulate and then deconstruct how they're done. Let's take a look at 3 images now, and I'll take you through what it took to create them. Here's one I've had some questions about. As you can see, everything's in focus with the exception of the moving water. This is a pretty popular effect, so nothing too earth-shatteringly unique here, but where do we start? We know we'll have to drag the shutter, meaning use a very slow shutter speed to blur the movement. Decreasing the shutter speed is a given, but without changing anything else, we'll overexpose our shot. Let's start by switching your camera to manual mode and decreasing your ISO all the way. The last thing we need is sensor gain when we're working with full sunlight and a long exposure. Of course, we'll also be minimizing the image noise here as well. We want maximum depth of field for all detail possible, so our next step will be to move our aperture to the highest f number, so the smallest diaphragm opening. The aperture ring might be on your lens barrel if it's a manual lens, and if it's not, you'll probably see it somewhere on your camera body. Remember, we'll be getting more light than we need with the sun out, and that ultra slow shutter speed. The last thing you'll do is decrease your shutter speed as much as possible without blowing out your highlights. Cameras with live view come in handy here because you'll see the effects of your shutter speed changes take place in real time in your LCD or electronic viewfinder as you make them. If you plan to use a shutter speed of 3 seconds or more like I did here, you'll definitely overexpose your shot without some help. We need to put sunglasses on our camera at this point, and that would be a neutral density filter. A shot like this will require the darkest ND you can get your hands on, or the darkest setting on a variable ND filter. Your camera will record even the slightest movement now, so a tripod is essential to getting this shot right. Making it really sing involves a little post work on the computer. Always shoot in RAW format if you've got the software to work with it. So much modern photography's creativity is expressed after the shooting is actually done. Here's an example of light painting. You'll find loads of amazing videos about how to produce images like this, but I'll just touch on the fundamentals here. Our last example showed us what can be done with dragging a shutter for 3 seconds. How about moving your actual light source around your subject while the sensor is open for 10 seconds or longer? This is how light painting got its name. You're literally painting your subject with light. You'll need a tripod for this one again. In this example, I used a $25 LED light panel on the end of a pole, but there's no reason you can't use a flashlight or whatever else is handy. If you use fire, I legally release myself from all responsibility in the event of property loss, injury, or death as a result of such activities. Find yourself the darkest and most interesting location you can. Your subject doesn't have to be something shiny, but shiny things do lend themselves to light painting. Increase your ISO to the point you can see enough to focus your camera manually. We're not using autofocus because we don't want the camera hunting for focus while we start turning lights on and off. Now, as we did before, we dump our ISO as low as we can and close up our aperture. This one will involve a little bit more trial and error because even with a live view enabled camera, you'll be doing everything in the dark until the last few seconds. If you're working alone, you'll want to have your shutter stay open long enough that you have time to move around your subject with your light source. Your level of exposure is affected by how long your light source is turned on, rather than how long the shutter is open, assuming you found a very dark location. If there are some other light sources in your area that you can't control, just keep in mind of their accumulative effect on your image. The reason I had my light on a pole was to keep myself from being lit, as well as allowing me to reach over the car and up high for the background streaks that you see. You don't have to do the entire image in one exposure. This one here was created with 3 exposures actually, and I brought them together in Photoshop using layers. My absolute most favorite subject to photograph is my little bullet of a niece Phoenix. The reason she's so perfect an example of photographing kids is because kids and pets are 2 very popular subjects that have one very challenging aspect to them in common. They move very quickly. So we'll have to prioritize shutter speed here. Of course, I shot this in daylight, so having enough light to crank up the shutter wasn't a problem. A very blurry background and blurry extreme foreground required an f-stop of 1.4. A tiny ISO was crucial, since even shooting at maximum shutter speed wasn't going to rein in the kind of light coming in through that massive f-stop. The focal length of the lens I used was an 85mm, which is considered by a lot of pros to be the ideal portrait length. That doesn't mean you can't take fantastic portraits with other lenses, but avoid wide-angle lenses at close distances unless you're going for that looking through a peephole look. Shooting bursts or multiple exposures successively comes in super handy in these situations, so you're increasing the probability of nailing the shot that you want. I was shooting 11 frames per second when I took this, and she actually had her eyes closed in the frame before and after this one. Well, hopefully today I've taken some of the fear out of manual mode for you guys, or maybe I've answered some questions that you might have had about apertures, shutters, ISO, or maybe I've given you some ideas as to what you can do when you're in manual mode. Perhaps I've just given you more questions. If that's the case, please make a comment in the comments area, and maybe I can do more comprehensive videos about some of the topics I've covered in the future. Thank you guys so much again for supporting me through this adventure called Chosen Idea. And please, keep working to make your chosen idea a reality. Until next time, peace. On a personal note, my girlfriend, who coincidentally loves photography and has been very supportive of this channel, she's a super sweet person, and I'm very lucky to have her. I decided to share with her that I wanted to include her somehow in this episode. I think she thought that I said that she would be appearing on camera, not on a camera.